So once again, I find myself sitting in my car to run it a bit so the battery doesn't go dead again. As you can see, there's still plenty of error lights on the screen. My glove box still won't close on its own, so the computer programming hasn't identified all the devices connected to it quite yet, but it should eventually. I've gone through this a few times now where I've actually run the battery completely dead, and the car usually comes back without needing a trip to a dealer or anything like that. There's not one where I live anyways, so it's a pretty big ordeal if I do have to take it to a dealer. Anyways, since my last story, I've been kind of thinking, what should be the next story that we talk about? And I decided that I would talk about what at the time I didn't give it much thought, but as an adult I look back on this experience and I go, man, that was really bizarre. And so would have been probably 1971 or 1972. I lived in Windsor, Ontario, which is just right on the edge of the Detroit River, and on the other side of the river you can actually see Detroit. And the public school that I went to there was just a regular public school, and it was walking distance from my house. So as a kid, me and my little brother would walk to school and walk home, and it was a good school. And I had a really good teacher that I had two teachers. One was a crabby old lady, and the other one was a nice, young, pretty, happy, friendly person. But the story's kind of bizarre, and as an adult looking back at it, I have an idea of what was going on now. Back then as a kid, I didn't know what was going on. And so I guess we'll just get into what actually happened. So one day, now you got to remember, I was a very observant little kid. I noticed everything that was going on around me, and I still do. And so I noticed that there was something going on. There were people who were in the school who were not part of the school staff. A lot of times when I tell the story, I just describe them as spooks because that's the best way to describe them. But I mean, you could almost say they were like Men in Black because they fit the description of Men in Black, the way they dress and behave and kind of stuff like that. But they were in and they were talking to the teachers, and there was a lot of sort of like behind the scenes activity going on. The thing that was kind of strange about it though is I believe none of the teachers knew this was going to happen. This was just like these guys showed up and then it happened. And our teacher came into our room and she said, "Class, we are going to do something new and interesting today." And she proceeded to explain to us what ESP was, extrasensory perception. And we went through some exercises and some games. And, the exercises and games were kind of like, your partner in the classroom. You'd pick a friend or a partner, and you'd get that partner to think of a number or think of a color, and then you would try to guess what they were thinking. And it was kind of fun, and it was interesting. It was different. It was the first time I had actually ever heard of ESP or been introduced to it. I may have heard it in passing possibly, but never paid attention. But this was the first time it was, sort of served up on a platter to me, and like, hey, this is ESP, and we're gonna practice to see, if we have it. And the thing that was weird about it was we were told that after, learning about it and doing some practice and so on, that we would actually be tested to see if we had ESP. Now, back then in 1971, I'm pretty sure parents didn't know anything about this. This was something that, somebody at government level or above showed up and said, we're going to do this. And the teachers and the principal had no say in the matter. Back then, school was a lot more hands-off. You could still get the strap or get your knuckles racked or be pulled by the ear by teachers if you misbehaved. And as I grew older, it ended up not being something that the teachers could do. It ended up being something that only, say, a principal would do. And then eventually, by the time I was in my older grades, it had stopped altogether. And but not just in the older grades, it had stopped in all grades because, parents had risen up, so to say, and said, hey, no, you're not going to beat our kids when they go to school. If you don't like their behavior, then there's other ways to deal with it. So it was back in those days, though, when you could still get strapped. So I'm gonna say that this sort of thing would likely not happen today, but back then it would. And so these people showed up, and we learned about ESP, and we practiced some games about it. And then it came time for everyone to be tested. So I went in and I sat across from this desk from somebody who I had no idea who this person was. This was not one of my school teachers. I don't know who he was. And I was told quite simply that he was going to be looking at some cards that I would never see, but he would look at the cards, and on the cards there would be a number or a color, and he would look at the card and think about whatever he saw on the card, and then I would have to tell him whatever impressions came to my mind. And it was very similar to the games that we were playing. So, I had been practicing this and was actually, kind of surprised how well I did at this game. And so I thought, this would be interesting, So I sat down and anxiously waiting, for him to start, with the first card. But before we got started, I heard this very distinct, clear voice came into my mind, and I don't know where this voice came from. And I thought about it many times, and where did this voice come from? Was it from this person himself, where he knew what was going to happen if I did well on this test and didn't really want to be a part of it, but he didn't have a choice? Was it from one of my teachers that had an inkling of what was going on and was trying to protect me? Was it from some otherworldly being, maybe an ancestral spirit? I'm not really sure. But the voice said quite distinctly in my head, Jerry, you do not want to pass this test. Now, I don't know how many times the voice spoke to me and said, Jerry, you do not want to pass this test. But I kind of think it was more than once. It was probably like 3 times in succession. Jerry, you do not want to pass this test. So I didn't quite know where this voice was coming from, but I decided that I would listen to the voice. So as we went through the test, if the thought came to my mind that, oh, okay, it's a number, and the number's 3, I wouldn't say 3. I would say 4, or 5, or maybe 7, or maybe 38. If a color came to mind, like, say it was the color blue, I wouldn't say blue, I'd say red. And so I did this through all the tests, and they never tested me again after that. They never came looking for me. And not too long after that, we moved to, the middle of nowhere, Ontario. And, nothing like this ever happened again. But I have wondered about it over the years, and now as an adult, and with the research I've done and people that I've talked to from that same time zone, this was one of the ways that they recruited people for MK Ultra and the Montage Chair and a few other programs. And they wanted to find young children who had ESP abilities, or even like more or less like some evidence that they had ESP abilities. So if you scored well on that test, they'd be like, okay, this kid is obviously picking up thoughts, and has some ability. And what they would do is they'd put them in these programs, and they would sell it to the parents as if it was like, hey, your kid is advanced, we want to put them in a special school so they can develop their skills and talents. And a lot of parents back in the day would be like, oh, my kid is special, oh, that's great, yeah, I'm going to support this, yes. And maybe they were being paid money even, for their kids to be in these, government-run special schools, special programs. But what was actually going on in those programs, and this has been told to me by people who were in those programs, is that they use the shock method to unleash their natural ESP abilities and to develop them and make them grow. And it's very similar to what you hear nowadays, like, you want to shock your system. So if you do interval training, you shock your system and it responds by building stronger muscles, and you end up being stronger and healthier. Well, the same thing works on your mind. They will tell you nowadays that, hey, if you want to make your mind more intelligent, when you step into the shower, turn on the shower immediately so you get blasted by cold water, and this will actually help your brain develop, because the shock to your system activates your growth response. And in the case of shocking yourself with cold water before your shower, what it does is it shocks your brain into producing more neurons and more electrical connections in the brain, therefore making you smarter. And so they use this type of technique on these children in these programs. And some of the techniques that they use were pretty bad. Like, I heard stories from friends that they were, put in a cage and snakes were dropped on them. I've heard some extreme stories where it extended even to forms of physical abuse, like torture. And even in some rare cases, I've heard them talk about that there was like forms of sexual abuse that were going on with these children to help develop these abilities and natural talents. So yeah, I would say I'm pretty glad I listened to that voice and I did not pass that test. So I guess I'll call this story the how to not be recruited as a child. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed my story, and I hope my monotone voice helped you fall asleep. My car still seems to have a bunch of engine failures. Maybe in a few days the computer will start remembering what it's supposed to be doing, and it will self-correct. But in any case, I'm keeping my battery charged, and I'm getting a chance to where I have some time to tell some stories. And I hope you enjoy the stories. I hope you fall asleep, and I hope you have a good night's sleep.